The wind came down from the ridges like a living thing, rattling the dry bones of cottonwoods and stirring loose dust into a grey veil across the valley. Elias Harlow leaned in his saddle, one gloved hand resting on the pommel, the other pulling his coat tighter across his chest. He had ridden 3 days through barren land, through emptiness that stretched out like punishment, and now the farmstead stood ahead of him, a squat shape against the failing light, walls leaning but not broken, chimney trailing a thin column of smoke that bent sideways with the gale. He thought of the paper folded in his thul bag. A deed signed in ink by some official who would never ride this far west, a document that said the land was his. The promise of solitude had drawn him here, silence enough to drown out the memory of his wife's face, the weight of her absence that haunted him more faithfully than any companion. He wanted only to work the soil until the day he joined her beneath it. But as his horse trod closer, Elias saw shadows moving on the porch. 3 of them. Women, tall and broad-shouldered, each carrying herself like a soldier in formation. The setting sun caught the braids of one, the shawl draped across another's shoulders, and the rifle resting steady in the hands of the third. They did not step back as he approached, they did not welcome him. Elias dismounted slowly, boots crunching against the frozen ground. He touched the brim of his hat, a gesture of weary civility, though his voice came hoarse from the cold. "Evening," he said. "Name's Harlow. Bought this place off county papers. Just riding in to claim it." The tallest of the women shifted her rifle slightly, not in threat, but in reminder. Her eyes were dark, measuring him as though he were a horse to be traded. The second, whose braid reached her waist, tilted her head with a kind of sadness that unsettled him more than any weapon. The third, wrapped in a faded wool shawl, spoke at last, her voice low but firm. "You're ours tonight." The words hung there, strange and solemn, carried off and returned by the wind. Elias frowned, unsure if he had heard right. He glanced between them, trying to read their faces. "I mean no harm," he said carefully. "Just looking for a roof, a fire. Papers say this is mine." The woman in the shawl stepped forward, closer to the light leaking from the cabin doorway. He could see the lines at the corners of her mouth, the tiredness etched deep from years of fending off hunger and winter. "Paper don't matter out here," she said. "Storm's coming. You ride on, you freeze before midnight. You stay, you share. Fire, food, watch. That's the cost. You're ours tonight, stranger. You want to live, you'll understand." Elias stood in the silence that followed, his breath clouding pale against the dusk. He looked at them, 3 women carved out of hardship, standing as though the earth itself had shaped them to endure. He thought of turning back, of pitching camp beneath the cottonwoods, but the wind clawed at his coat, and snow threatened in the low black belly of the sky. He felt the weight of loneliness pressing heavier than the saddle he had carried all day. He gave a slow nod. "All right then." The woman with the rifle gestured with the barrel toward the porch. He climbed the steps, ducked into the doorway. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and boiled beans, of hides drying along the wall. A fire licked at the stone hearth, casting orange light across rough-hewn beams. There were 3 chairs, each carved by hand, and a 4th dragged in from outside, as though left for no one in particular. He removed his hat, holding it against his chest, and set his thul bag down by the door. None of the women smiled, but none turned him out. They moved with the silence of those long accustomed to one another, each knowing her place without words. One set a pot nearer the fire. Another fetched a mug and filled it with black coffee, bitter enough to sting his tongue. The third leaned her rifle against the wall but kept her hand near it. Elias sat, stiff and weary, and listened to the storm begin its slow rise outside, the whistle in the cracks, the drum of sleet against the roof. He realized with a chill that had little to do with the weather that he had stumbled into a place not his own. Ownership was paper. Life, here, was earned in sweat, guarded with rifles, shared in silence. He studied them by firelight. They were alike and not alike, sisters, perhaps, or bound by something deeper. Apache in their eyes, settler in their bearing, lost braided into the very strands of their hair. They did not ask him questions, and he did not offer answers. The crackle of burning pine filled the spaces where words might have lived. When the shawled woman set a bowl of beans before him, Elias lifted his eyes to hers. He expected reproach, or indifference. What he saw instead was something harder to name, a recognition of loneliness, an understanding of hunger, not just of the body, but of the soul. He nodded his thanks. They ate without talk. Outside, the storm raged louder. The cabin shuddered, yet held firm, and Elias felt, for the first time in many months, the faintest ember of belonging, as if, for this night at least, he was not drifting alone across a barren map. Still, unease lingered. He did not know their names, their past, or what claim they held upon this place. But when the last of the beans were scraped from the pot, and the fire cast long shadows against the walls, Elias realized one thing with quiet certainty: the farmstead would not bend to him as its owner. He had stepped into a world already carved by others, and if he stayed, he would live by their mercy. The wind howled, rattling the shutters. The sisters exchanged no words, only glances, as though all speech had already been spent in years before. Elias sat with his empty bowl, feeling the ache in his chest soften against the glow of firelight. "You're ours tonight," the shawled woman had said. And as the storm clawed at the door, Elias understood. It was not possession, but survival, not demand, but an invitation cloaked in warning. And weary as he was, he found he did not mind the weight of it. Morning came with a pale light that seeped through the chinks in the cabin walls, a grey dawn blurred by the storm's remnants. Elias woke stiff on the chair where he had dozed, the blanket someone had wordlessly draped over him still warm at his shoulders. The three women moved quietly about the room, each absorbed in her own task, as if the stranger at their hearth did not alter the rhythm carved by years of endurance. One was stirring a pot at the fire, her shawl pulled close, the steam rising around her like smoke. Another sat near the window, a knife in her hand, drawing it through the length of her black braid, tightening the strands with slow, deliberate care. The third bent over a workbench by the wall, fitting a handle to an old farming hoe with the patience of someone repairing a friend rather than a tool. None of them spoke to him, yet he felt their presence as sharply as the chill that crept in under the door. It was then Elias noticed the coat slung across the chair back. Stiff with wear, patched at the elbows, the leather carried the shape of a man who was not there. The woman at the fire glanced at it once, her jaw tightening before she turned back to the pot. Elias knew the look, the way a widow stared at what could not be replaced, the weight of a garment that had outlived its owner. His gaze moved about the cabin. On the wall hung rifles, not polished for show but kept within reach. By the hearth, a rocking chair shifted gently with the draught, as though someone invisible had just risen from it. Against the far wall sat a wooden trunk, the lid cracked open enough to show a glimpse of white fabric folded inside. The edge of lace, yellowed with years. A wedding dress, kept though its purpose had long passed. Elias cleared his throat, uneasy with the silence. "Your land runs wide," he said softly, more to fill the emptiness than to ask. "Took me near half a day to ride the fences." The woman at the window braided in silence, her knife glinting each time she drew it down the strands. The one mending tools didn't look up. At last the shawled woman at the fire spoke, her tone even. "Fences don't stop hunger. Or bullets. Or winter." He nodded, knowing the truth in it. The steam from her pot smelled of corn and beans, and it reminded him of nights long ago when his wife had cooked the same, humming a tune he could not now recall. He found himself speaking before he meant to. "My wife lies under snow," Elias said, voice low, almost carried away by the crackle of the fire. 3 winters passed. Fever took her quick, buried her slower. I rode after that. Nowhere to go but forward. The words hung heavy. He had not told the story aloud in months. It startled him to hear it again, to feel the old wound shift under his ribs. The women did not answer. The one braiding her hair kept her eyes on the strands, though her fingers faltered for half a breath. The woman with the coat stirred the pot with greater force, beans bumping against the tin sides. Only the one at the workbench looked up, meeting his eyes. She did not speak, but in her gaze he found no judgment, only recognition. Outside, the wind groaned against the walls. Elias sipped the bitter coffee they gave him and watched them move through the cabin, each carrying a silence that spoke of years before him. He realized they did not need his story. They had their own, carved deeper, wounds that had shaped them into giants of endurance. Later, while helping carry wood from the pile, Elias stepped behind the cabin and saw more signs of their past. A child's carved toy, weathered near the shed. A horse's bridle hanging unused, cracked with age. And etched into the post by the door, faint letters, a man's name half scoured by wind. When he returned inside, he felt the cabin differently. Every board, every tool, every shawl draped across the window carried a memory, a guard against what had been lost. He understood then that the walls were built not only of timber but of grief, and grief had made them stronger than stone. That night they ate together again, silence broken only by the clink of spoons against tin. The firelight drew shadows long across the floor. Elias found his eyes returning to the trunk, the hint of lace within. He wondered which sister had worn it, or if it had ever been worn at all. He wondered if it was kept as hope or as mourning. He did not ask. Some questions, he knew, were wounds left better covered. Instead he spoke of small things, a river he had crossed, a horse he once lost to thieves, the way his wife used to mend his shirts by lamplight. His words were not answered, but they were heard. He felt it in the stillness of the women, in the way they did not turn away. The night stretched, the wind eased, and the valley sank into quiet. Elias sat near the fire, staring into it heart, feeling the shadows of the past press close from every corner. He realized then that none of them, not he, not the three women, lived without ghosts. They carried them like shawls, like rifles, like braids that would never be cut. And though the silence was heavy, it was also shared. In that strange communion, he felt a shift, not belonging, not yet, but a recognition that loneliness did not live in him alone. The cabin, with its ghosts and its grief, held space enough for his. The storm arrived with a violence that seemed to split the valley in two. Snow drove against the cabin walls like fists, whistling through every crack and seam, rattling the shutters until the timbers groaned. Elias woke before dawn to the sound of it, the roof moaning under drifts, the air so cold that his breath rose in clouds even beside the fire. The sisters moved with quiet efficiency, banking coals, closing gaps with rags and shawls, their faces set with the calm of those who had survived storms before. Elias pulled on his coat and went out into the white raw. The wind struck him sideways, near taking him from his feet. He bent his head, eyes stinging, and dragged wood from the frozen pile. His hands burned, then numbed, then burned again as he split logs with an axe, the sound lost in the storm's fury. When he brought the load inside, the women said nothing, only added it to the stack by the hearth. But he saw the brief flicker in their eyes, a silent acknowledgement that he was earning his keep. The hours bled into one another, day swallowed by night, then day again, the storm unrelenting. Elias mended hinges on the shed door that moaned in the wind. He patched the chinks between logs with strips of cloth, cooked what beans and dried meat they had left. He spoke little, and they spoke less, but slowly, a thread of trust began to weave between them. Not warmth, not yet, but necessity. On the third night, as sleet turned to heavy snow, a sound broke through the storm, a pounding at the door, sharp and urgent. The sisters stiffened, rifles in hand, before Elias had even risen. The pounding came again, followed by a muffled cry. Elias reached for the door, but the woman in the shawl was already there, rifle lifted, her shadow long in the firelight. She flung the door open, and the storm burst in with a flurry of snow and a man half falling across the threshold. He was young, his skin dark, his braids heavy with ice. Blood marked his sleeve, soaking through cloth stiff with frost. His breath rattled as he sagged against the wall, snow spilling from his shoulders. Elias swore under his breath, hand going to the knife at his belt. But the sisters moved as one, lifting him, dragging him toward the fire, stripping away the ice-crusted coat with practiced care. "Hold," Elias barked, his voice hard. "You don't know who he is. Could be trouble at his heels." The braid-haired sister shot him a look that silenced him more effectively than any rifle. Her dark eyes burned with something unyielding. "His hours now," she said simply, her voice sharp as flint. They laid the man, Koa, one of them whispered, on a pallet near the hearth. His wound was deep but clean, a bullet grazed torn across his arm. The shawled woman pressed cloth to it, while the tallest sister stitched with hands that did not tremble. Elias watched, unease knotting in his chest. Apache. A man of the same people whose raids had burned cabins like this one, whose vengeance lingered across the borderlands. Koa's eyes opened once, fever-bright, and fixed on Elias. No words passed, but something in that gaze unsettled him more than the storm. Elias turned away, feeding wood into the fire, jaw tight. The cabin shrank with the storm's rage outside, for strangers pressed into its glow. The women tended Koa with quiet care, their movements sure, almost reverent. Elias chopped more wood, cooked broth, fixed what he could, small offerings to prove his place. Yet the air thickened with suspicion, every glance a test, every silence a weight. That night, sleep came fitful. Elias lay on the floor wrapped in his blanket, listening to the moan of wind, the wheeze of Koa's breath, the rustle of shawls as the sisters moved softly in the dark. He felt the knife hilt under his hand, the old reflex of a man who had lost too much to trust easily. But above the fear, something else stirred, a strange respect for the way they had taken the wounded man in without question, as if mercy was not a choice but a law written in their blood. Morning came grey and relentless, snow piled high against the door. Elias rose and pushed it open, shoving back drifts until light flooded the cabin. The valley lay buried, the fences invisible, the world hushed beneath a white shroud. He looked back at the firelit room, the three women, the wounded man, the rifles by the door. It struck him then, as sharp as the cold on his face, whatever he had expected when he rode into this valley, solitude, ownership, escape, it was gone. The storm had bound them together, not by choice but by survival. He was no longer alone, and whether he liked it or not, his life now tangled with theirs. The storm had made them one household. The question, he knew, was whether suspicion or trust would govern it. The snow pressed down heavy upon the valley, burying fences and tracks until the world beyond the cabin ceased to exist. Inside, the fire burned low and steady, shadows reaching across the beams like black fingers. Elias felt the weight of the place closing in on him, the walls carrying not only the storm but the silence of those who lived within them. The three women moved about him with an ease born of long habit. Each seemed to know the other's thoughts without words, glances passing like signals. To Elias, their unity was both comfort and exclusion. He sensed rivalries beneath the surface, the sharp way one would take a tool from the other's hand, the flicker of disapproval when one lingered too close to Koa's side, but it was a rivalry that belonged to them, not to him. He remained the outsider, tolerated, never invited. Koa's presence deepened the unease. Though wounded, the young man carried himself with a quiet strength. He hardly spoke, but the sisters watched him as though he were brother or son, shielding him with a devotion Elias could not understand. More than once he caught them tending his bandage by lamplight, murmuring in low voices that carried tones older than English. Elias busied himself with small labors, splitting wood, scraping ice from the eaves, fixing loose boards, but each task seemed to set him apart rather than weave him in. At night, he lay awake by the fire, the blanket pulled to his chin, listening. He heard the shift of shawls as the women wrapped themselves tight. He heard the muffled weeping of one when she thought the others asleep. The fire crackled, casting light upon rifles leaned near at hand. The weight of their grief filled the room like smoke, leaving no space for him. One evening, the tension broke. Elias had gone to check the door at dusk, snow crusting against the threshold. When he returned, Koa's hand rested on Elias's rifle, turning it over slowly, testing the balance. The sight of it cut Elias cold. "That's mine," he said, voice low. Koa looked up, his dark eyes steady, and for a moment neither man moved. The sisters froze as well, caught in the taut line between them. Elias stepped forward, hand outstretched. "Set it down." Koa's jaw tightened, but after a long silence he laid the rifle back against the wall. Elias took it up at once, cradling it as though it were more than wood and steel, as though it were his last claim of self in a place that was not his. No words followed. The sisters returned to their tasks, but their glances lingered. Elias felt shame press against his anger, shame that he did not trust the one they called kin. Yet mistrust clung to him as stubborn as frost. That night, as the cabin slept uneasy, a new sound pierced the silence. A low howl, drawn long and mournful, rising from the snow-clad woods. Another answered, closer. Then another, until the valley rang with the hungry chorus of wolves. The horses in the shed stamped and snorted, hooves striking wood. The sisters rose at once, rifles in hand, shawls pulled tight against their shoulders. Elias gripped his own weapon, stepping into his boots. Koa too rose from his pallet, pale but determined, his arms still bound but his stance steady. For the first time, they stood together in the doorway, 4 figures braced against the night. The wind cut sharp as they opened the door, snow swirling in silver sheets beneath the moon. Shadows moved at the tree line, eyes gleaming, bodies pacing restless in the drifts. The wolves circled, their cries sharp with hunger. Without a word, Elias took position by the tallest sister, rifle raised. Koa stood opposite, the braid-haired woman at his side. They formed a line, shoulder to shoulder, the cold biting their faces, their breath steaming in the air. The first wolf lunged, a dark streak across the snow. A shot cracked, echoing like thunder through the valley. The beast tumbled, and the others paused, circling wider. Another darted close. Elias fired, the recoil biting his shoulder. A sister's shawl whipped in the wind as she leveled her rifle, dropping another that had broken too near the shed. For long minutes they fought as one, every shot measured, every movement shared. The wolves pressed and fell back again, until at last the chorus broke and the shadows melted into the dark. The silence that followed was heavy, the kind that trembled in the bones. They lowered their rifles slowly. The breath of each hung in the air, ragged but alive. Elias turned, catching Koa's eyes across the drift. No words passed, but the look was different now, not suspicion, not challenge, but recognition. They had stood the same line, faced the same hunger in the snow. When they returned inside, stamping frost from their boots, The fire seemed warmer than it had in days. The sisters hung their rifles by the hearth. Elias laid his across his knees, staring into the flames. Koa sank back onto his pallet, pale with exhaustion, but his gaze still steady. For the first time since he had come, Elias felt the walls of the cabin ease their weight. The air still carried grief, still carried silence, but beneath it ran a thread of something new, the beginning of acceptance, faint as the ember glow. He understood then that they were not his enemies. They were mirrors, each scarred by loss, each fighting to survive in a world that had stripped them of nearly everything. In the hush that followed, Elias realized he had not only defended the cabin. He had defended his place within it. The valley softened as winter loosened its grip. Snow melted into rivulets that sang through the gullies, swelling the creek until it ran fast and clear again. Patches of earth showed dark and wet beneath the thinning drifts, and the air carried the scent of thawed soil, rich and promising. Elias felt it in his bones, the stirring of life after long months of stillness, the same slow shift mirrored within the cabin. The women moved differently now. Their steps carried less urgency, their shoulders less burden. Shawls still hung heavy around them, but sometimes Elias caught laughter slipping out unguarded, light as the water dripping from the eaves. Once, as he patched a fence line that had collapsed under snow, he heard them singing softly together inside, voices weaving a tune that belonged to no him he knew. It startled him, the sweetness of it, the way it carried into the open air like smoke rising from the chimney. Koa, too, began to mend. The wound on his arm healed, leaving him restless. At first Elias had kept distance, suspicion still flickering like an ember, but work bridged what words could not. They repaired fences side by side, set traps along the creek, shared the strain of lifting timbers. Their talk was spare, a word here, a gesture there, but in silence they learned the measure of each other. Elias found respect where distrust had once sat heavy, and though he did not name it, he began to trust the young man as he trusted the turning of the seasons. Evenings stretched longer with the sun. One dusk, the sisters built a fire outside, stacking wood high until flames roared upward, bright against the deepening sky. They sat in a circle, faces lit gold and red, rifles leaning close but untouched. Elias joined them, awkward at first, unsure if his presence was welcome. Yet none turned him away. Stories unfolded in the firelight, not all in English, but in gestures, in laughter, in words that drifted between tongues. The braid-haired woman spoke of their father's hands, how they had shaped the very tools Elias had seen her mend. The tall one told of a horse long gone, swift and proud, who had carried them through raids and storms. Even Koa added a tale, halting in speech but steady in his telling, of rivers further west that shone like glass under the sun. Elias listened more than he spoke, his voice rough with disuse when he did share. He told them of the cabin he had once built with his wife, of the way she stitched curtains bright with flowers, of how snow had buried the roof one winter but they had laughed through it, young and unbroken. His throat closed as he remembered the grave dug hard in frozen ground, but the fire softened the ache, and the silence that followed did not shame him. The stars wheeled above, bright and cold, vast enough to hold their grief and their hope both. Elias leaned back, watching sparks climb skyward like prayers. For the first time in years, he felt his chest ease, not empty but full, the weight of loneliness lifting like snow in the sun. It was then he felt it, the soft touch of wool laid across his shoulders. He turned slightly, and the shawled woman's eyes met his for a brief moment before she looked back at the fire. No word passed between them. The shawl was not gift nor claim, but a gesture older than either, a recognition, a quiet folding of him into their circle. Elias lowered his eyes, his hand brushing the fabric. Warmth spread through him, not of desire, but of belonging. He had thought himself buried with his wife, his heart too weathered to hold anything but memory. Yet here, beneath stars and firelight, with strangers bound by loss and resilience, he felt a spark. Not passion, but kinship. Not a promise, but a place. The fire burned low, shadows drawing longer, the cold creeping back as night deepened. One by one they rose, leaving the embers to fade. Elias lingered a moment, gazing at the shawl across his shoulders, then followed them inside. Lying awake by the hearth, listening to the steady breath of those around him, he realized something he had not dared before. Love did not need to be spoken or claimed. It lived in small acts, in fences mended together, in stories shared, in the quiet laying of a shawl. It was not the fire that consumed, but the one that endured. And for the first time since his wife's grave disappeared beneath snow, Elias allowed himself to believe he had not reached the end of his story. The morning came sharp with frost, the kind that bites the lungs and makes each breath hang heavy in the air. Elias was up before the others, feeding the fire and pulling his coat tight, when the sound of hooves broke the valley's silence. Not the soft tread of deer or elk, but the hard rhythm of men riding with purpose. He stepped outside into the pale light, and there they were, 5 riders cutting through the thawing snow, rifles slung loose across their saddles, eyes fixed on the cabin. The sisters stirred at once, shawls thrown aside, rifles lifted as if they had slept with them in hand. Koa limped to the doorway, his face set. Elias's stomach dropped. He knew the look of such men, debt collectors, claim jumpers, the kind who believed paper and violence were equal currency. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man with a beard white as ash, dismounted and called out, "This land was seized for unpaid debt. Belongs to us now. Pack what you've got and leave before sundown." No one moved. The sisters stood firm, shawls dark against the snow, rifles steady. Elias felt the weight of the moment pressing down. He thought of his deed folded in his satchel, meaningless now. Ownership was nothing against the barrel of a gun. When the silence stretched, the leader spat in the snow. "You got till dawn," he growled, and the men wheeled their horses, riding off to camp on the ridge. The cabin was restless that night. Fire crackled low, shawls drawn close, the air heavy with unspoken fear. Elias sat with his rifle across his knees, remembering other nights of waiting, other mornings when shots rang out. He looked at the sisters, at Koa sharpening a blade by lamplight, and felt something shift. He could leave, slip away before blood stained the snow. But the thought twisted in his gut. Leaving would mean returning to the hollow ache of solitude, the endless road. Staying meant standing with them, even if it meant dying on ground that had never truly been his. Dawn came pale and merciless. The riders returned, rifles raised. The first crack split the morning like thunder, wood splintering from the cabin's wall. Elias fired back from the doorway, the recoil jolting through his shoulder, smoke stinging his eyes. The sisters moved like shadows beside him, steady and fierce, their shots sure. Koa slipped out a back door, flanking through the snow. The valley roared with gunfire. Horses reared, men shouted, rifles cracked until the echoes rolled against the ridges. Elias fought without thought, his world narrowed to breath, aim, fire. One rider fell, blood blooming on the snow. Another screamed as Koa's blade flashed. The sisters stood unbroken, shawls whipping in the wind, their defiance as sharp as their bullets. It ended as sudden as it began. The surviving men fled, leaving their dead scattered in the drift. Silence rushed in, broken only by the rasp of breathing, the hiss of melting snow where fire had spat from rifle barrels. Elias lowered his gun, his hand shaking, and looked at the ground, red against white, life seeping into earth. They had won, though none of them were untouched. Koa's arm bled fresh, one sister limped where a bullet had grazed her leg. Elias felt a searing cut along his side, hot beneath his coat. But they stood together. When the bodies were dragged aside and the ridge fell quiet, Elias saddled his horse. His hands moved slow, heavy, each buckle a weight. He told himself it was mercy to leave. He had brought trouble with his papers, his deed, his foolish belief that land could be owned by ink. Better to ride on, to spare them further blood. He swung into the saddle, the valley stretching wide before him, the wind cutting cold against his face. Behind, the cabin stood small but unbroken, smoke curling from its chimney. He urged the horse forward. "Elias!" The voice stopped him. He turned, reins tight in his grip. The sisters stood at the edge of the yard, shawls drawn close, rifles at their sides. Their eyes met his, steady, unyielding. One of them called out again, her voice carrying clear through the crisp morning air. "You're ours tonight." Not sharp this time. Not command. An offering. The word struck him deeper than any bullet. They were not claiming him as prisoner, nor as debtor, but as kin. As man, as soul, as one of their own. Elias sat frozen in the saddle, throat tight, until his hands eased the reins and the horse stilled. Slowly, he dismounted. Each step back toward the cabin felt heavier and lighter all at once. He passed the trampled snow where blood still marked the earth, where fire had roared, where death had nearly claimed them all. And then he stepped back into the circle of their firelight. The shawl was waiting. Laid across his shoulders once more, soft and sure. He bowed his head, unable to speak, but the warmth spread through him, not just of wool, but of belonging. That night, the fire burned high. They sat together, bruised, bandaged, alive. No one spoke of deeds or ownership, of debt or land. It no longer mattered. Home was not something Elias had claimed by paper, nor something he had fought to take. Home was what had claimed him, in rifle smoke and blood, in shawls and silence, in voices that called him back when he would have gone alone. And for the first time in years, Elias Harlow did not wonder where the road would lead. He knew he had already arrived.